Garrett Sloan looked out the window as their old pickup truck rolled down the Idaho highway, cutting through the gray veil of the November morning. The road was empty, only rare trucks flashed in the distance, like ghosts dissolving in the fog. April sat next to her head buried in her phone, her fingers flickering across the screen at the usual speed. She didn't look at him. It has been a long time since she looked at him the way she used to, with warmth, with something that once made his heart beat faster. Now her gaze was somewhere else, even when she was nearby. "How much longer?" she asked without looking up from the screen. The voice was even, but there was a hint of annoyance in it, as if it was his fault that the road was dragging on. "Half an hour," Garrett answered briefly, squeezing the steering wheel a little tighter than necessary. "Maybe less if there are no traffic jams in the city." April nodded without looking up. Her dark hair, neatly styled, glistened in the dim light. She looked younger than 45 she always did. Garrett sometimes thought that time was passing her by while he himself was covered with new wrinkles and gray hair. But he didn't complain. Never. Work at a construction site, 2 children, a house that he built with his own hands, all this was his life. And April was part of it. The main part, at least that's what he thought. They were going to the wake of her mother, Ruth. The old woman died a week ago, quietly, in her sleep, as if she had decided not to bother anyone even for the last time. Garrett was not close to his mother-in-law, but he respected her. Ruth always carried herself with dignity, even when life hit her in the face. April, on the other hand, was attached to her, although they had rarely seen each other in recent years. "Too much work, too much to do." That's what she said. "Are you okay?" he asked, glancing at his wife. April finally looked up from her phone and looked at him. Her eyes, blue as Lake Tahoe on a clear day, seemed colder than usual. "Yes," she answered, and there was no trace of tears or pain in her voice. "It's just, it's weird." She was so alive, and suddenly that's it. Garrett nodded, not knowing what to say. He never knew how to choose words at such moments. Instead, he turned on the radio. An old Bruce Springsteen song filled the booth, but April immediately turned it off. "Don't," she said. "I want silence." He didn't mind. Silence has been their companion for a long time. Ruth's house was on the outskirts of Boise, in a quiet neighborhood where the houses were old and the trees were tall. When they arrived, the yard was already full of cars. Relatives, neighbors, some unfamiliar faces, everyone gathered to say goodbye. Garrett parked the pickup at the curb and turned off the engine. "Shall we go?" he asked, opening the door. April nodded, but paused, fixing her makeup in the mirror. She always did this before going out to people. Garrett waited, standing by the car, looking at the house. The white paint on the walls was peeling. The shutters were lopsided. He offered to renovate it for Ruth a couple of years ago, but she refused. "I feel good as it is," she said then, and Garrett did not insist. Inside the house was full of people. The smell of coffee, flowers, and something sweet, probably pies, hung in the air. Garrett greeted several acquaintances, shook a couple of hands, nodded in condolences. April immediately walked away to a group of women who surrounded her like a flock of birds. She smiled, hugged them, and accepted words of comfort. Garrett looked at her from a distance and thought how naturally she carried herself. Always held on, as if she was born to be the center of attention. "Garrett," a familiar voice called out to him. It was Dan, an old friend of Ruth's, who once worked with Garrett in construction. "My condolences, man. Ruth was, real." "Yes," Garrett nodded, shaking his hand. "Thank you for coming." They talked a little about the weather, about how quickly time flies. Dan offered to drink to Ruth, and Garrett agreed. They walked into the living room, where there was a tray of whiskey bottles and glasses on the table. Someone had already poured drinks, and Garrett took one, feeling the warmth of the glass soothing his palm. "To Ruth," Dan said, raising his glass. "For Ruth," Garrett echoed. The whiskey burned my throat, but left a pleasant aftertaste. Garrett wasn't much of a drinker, but today it felt right. He set the glass down and noticed April looking at him from across the room. Their eyes met for a second, and she smiled briefly, almost automatically. Then she turned away. "I'll go to the kitchen," he told Dan. "We need help with the dishes or something else." Dan nodded, already distracted by a conversation with someone else. Garrett walked through the crowd, feeling the air become heavier with voices and smells. The kitchen was quieter. There were two women bustling around it seemed like Ruth's neighbors. They put sandwiches on trays and talked about how quickly they had organized everything. "Need help?" Garrett asked, stopping in the doorway. "Oh, Garrett, honey," one of them, an elderly woman with gray hair, smiled at him. "Everything is under control. But if you want, you can take the trash away. The bag is in the corner." He nodded and walked towards the corner of the kitchen, where there was a black plastic bag. As he picked it up, he noticed an old cardboard box leaning against the wall. It was shabby, with faded letters on the side. Something like "personal belongings" was written in marker, but the letters were almost erased. The box looked like it hadn't been opened in years. "Should I throw this out too?" he asked, pointing to the box. The woman who had spoken to him turned around. "Oh, I don't know, honey. Ruth kept some old letters and photographs there. Maybe April would like to pick it up. Ask her." Garrett nodded, but something made him hesitate. He put the trash bag back and sat down next to the box. The lid was not tightly closed, and a corner of the photograph was sticking out from under it. He pulled on it, and the black and white photograph slipped into his hands. April was in the photo. Young, about 20 years old, in a light dress, with a smile that he remembered from their first dates. She stood next to a man tall, in a suit, with neatly styled hair. They were at some kind of event, judging by the background tables, flowers, people in evening dresses. The man had his arm around her waist, and April looked happy, not like with him, in a different way. Garrett felt something tighten in his chest. He turned the photo over. On the back, there was an inscription made in black pen, B and E 1995. He and April met in 1996. April's voice made him flinch. She stood in the kitchen doorway, looking at him with slight surprise. "What are you doing there?" He quickly put the photo back in the box and stood up, feeling the blood rush to his face. "Nothing," he said, trying to keep his voice even. "I'm just cleaning up the trash." She looked at the box, then at him. Her gaze lingered a second longer than necessary, but she didn't say anything. She just nodded. "Let's go," she said. "They are going to make a toast there." Garrett nodded, but as he followed her, he felt something inside him begin to crack. It was as if a thin crack had passed through the foundation he had spent 25 years building. The rest of the day passed in a kind of fog. Toasts, tears, handshakes. Garrett did everything that was expected of him. He smiled when he needed to. He hugged April when she snuggled up to him. He said the right words. But his thoughts returned to that box, to photography, to the inscription. When they finally got into the car to drive home, it was already dark. April was silent, looking out the window. Garrett wanted to ask. I wanted to say something, but instead he simply started the engine. "Are you okay?" she asked as they pulled onto the highway. "Yes," he answered without looking at her. "I'm just tired." She nodded and turned her attention back to her phone. And Garrett looked at the road and thought that, perhaps for the first time in 25 years, he did not know who was sitting next to him. When they got home, April went straight to the bedroom, saying she wanted to go to bed early. Garrett remained in the living room, sitting on the couch with a bottle of beer in his hand. The TV was turned off, and there was silence in the house. He thought about the box, about what else could be inside. Letters, photographs, some pieces of life that he knew nothing about. He got up and went to the window. Behind the glass was their yard neat, with trimmed grass and a swing he built for Emma when she was 5. Everything he did was for them. For April, for Logan, for Emma. But now he wasn't sure it mattered. Garrett finished his beer and put the bottle on the table. Tomorrow he will return to that house. He'll take the box. He went to bed, but sleep did not come. In the darkness of the bedroom, he listened to April's steady breathing and thought about how thin the line was between truth and lies, and how easily it can break. The next day, Garrett woke up early. April was still asleep, and he didn't wake her. I wrote a note saying that I would go to work, although I knew that today was Saturday. Construction could wait, but the box is not. He drove to Ruth's house, feeling his heart beating a little faster than usual. Questions swirled in his head that he didn't want to answer. Who is this man? Why did April never mention him? And why was this photo hidden in the box as a secret? When he entered the house, it was quiet. There was no one, only the smell of yesterday's coffee and flowers still hung in the air. Garrett walked into the kitchen, feeling like a thief in someone else's house. The box stood there in the corner. He sat down next to him and opened the lid. Inside was what he expected and what he feared. Letters tied up tape. Photos neatly stacked. Several old postcards. He took the first letter and unfolded it. The handwriting was neat and masculine. The first lines made him freeze. "My dear April, I know this shouldn't go on, but every time I see you, I can't stop." Garrett closed the letter without finishing. His hands were shaking. He looked at the box, then at the door, as if expecting April to come in and explain everything. But she didn't come in, and there was no one to explain. He took the box, closed it, and carried it to the car. Garrett Sloan sat in his pickup truck on the edge of a construction site where the air smelled of dust and freshly cut wood. The morning was cold, but he didn't notice it. A box of letters and photographs lay on the passenger seat, attracting his gaze like a magnet. He didn't want to open it here, amid the roar of excavators and the screams of workers, but it was impossible to pull it any further. Last night, spent half asleep, only intensified the feeling that he was standing on the edge of an abyss, and the only way to understand how deep it is to look inside. He turned off the radio, which was quietly muttering something about the weather, and reached for the box. The lid creaked open, revealing letters once again, neatly tied with faded blue ribbon. There were not many of them, a dozen, maybe a little more. He took the top one carefully, as if it might explode in his hands. The envelope was old, yellowed, with a faint smell of dust. The address on it was written in neat handwriting. April Wilson, Boise, Idaho. Wilson, her maiden name. This was before him, before their wedding, before everything. Garrett unfolded the letter. The paper crunched, as if protesting that it was being disturbed after so many years. He started reading. "My dear April, I know this is wrong. I know we have to stop. But every time I see you, all I can think about is your smile, your eyes, the way you laugh when you think no one is watching. I can't stop thinking about you, even when I know it's destroying us both. We'll see you on Friday as usual. I'll be waiting. Yours B." Garrett froze, feeling the blood pounding in his temples. "Your B." He reread the signature, then again, as if hoping that the letters would change. But they haven't changed. He placed the letter on his lap and stared into space. B. Who the hell is B? And why did April keep these letters? Why did her mother keep them? He took the next letter, then another. They were all from the same person. B. Wrote about meetings in cafes on the outskirts of the city, about long walks by the river, about how he dreams of a future that they will never have. There was a line in one of the letters that stuck in Garrett's memory. "You say you love him, but I know that a part of you belongs to me, and always will." Hi, it's about him, about Garrett. He squeezed the letter so that the paper crumpled in his fist. Garrett leaned back in his seat, trying to take a deep breath. The air in the cabin seemed thick like syrup. He didn't know what he was feeling, rage, pain, or something else that had no name. All he knew was that April, the woman with whom he shared his bed, his home, his life, was not who he thought she was, and perhaps she never was. He took out the photo he saw yesterday, April and that man. Now he looked at him more carefully. Tall, with sharp features, in an expensive suit. Something about his posture, the way he carried himself, seemed familiar. Garrett turned the photo over. B and E, 1995. He placed the photograph next to the letters and closed his eyes. I had to think. It was necessary to understand. The construction site was noisy, but Garrett couldn't hear anything except his own pulse. He locked the truck and walked to his trailer, a small office where he kept blueprints, contracts, and a coffee maker that only worked every now and then. He could have been there alone. There, he could figure it out. Inside the trailer, it was cramped but cozy. There were papers on the table, a couple of empty coffee mugs, and a framed photo of him, April, Logan, and Emma at the lake a couple of years ago. Garrett looked at her and felt something tighten in his chest. He put the frame in his desk drawer, not wanting to see their smiles. Not now. He sat down and opened the box again. Now he was ready to read further. The next letter was dated 1996, the year he met April. It was shorter, but the words in it cut like a knife. April, you said you were marrying him. I don't believe you're happy. I don't believe that you forgot me. But I respect your choice. If you ever change your mind, you know where to find me. I will always be waiting. Brad. Brad. Garrett repeated the name out loud, tasting it. It was bitter. Brad. He knew the name. Brad Huntley. A local politician, a man whose face appeared on billboards and in the news. Huntley was older than Garrett, about 10 years, but he looked younger, well-groomed, with the self-confidence that comes with money and power. Garrett had seen him a couple of times at town events where April had dragged him, even though he hated such gatherings. Huntley was always the center of attention, with a smile that seemed glued to his face. He took another letter, but now his hands moved faster, almost feverishly. Dates, words, promises. All this was not just a romance. It was a whole life that April led behind his back. In one of the letters, Huntley mentioned a trip to Seattle, where April went for work in 2001. Garrett remembered that trip. She returned a week later with gifts for the children and a smile that seemed sincere at the time. Now he saw her differently. But something else was bothering him. Signatures. They were acquaintances. Not just acquaintances, he had seen them before. Garrett stood up, walked to the closet in the corner of the trailer, and pulled out an old box where he kept family albums. He rarely opened them. That was April's territory. She loved to arrange photographs, caption them, and turn memories into neat stories. Garrett didn't mind. He liked that she cared about such things. He opened the first album. Wedding, 1997. April is in a white dress. He is in a suit, which then seemed too tight for him. The next page was their first New Year's together, and then congratulations. From friends, from relatives, and one from Huntley. To Garrett and April, best of luck and many more years together. Brad Huntley. The signature was the same slant of the letters, the same curl on B. Garrett felt the floor disappear from under his feet. He opened another album. Logan's birthday, 2005. Among the cards is another one from Huntley. Baby Logan, grow up big. Brad. Same signature. The same hand. Garrett flipped through the pages, finding more and more confirmation. Huntley had been in their lives from the very beginning. Not just an acquaintance, not just a family friend. He was the shadow that followed them all these years. Garrett leaned back in his chair, looking at the scattered letters and albums. His mind tried to piece everything together, but the pieces of the puzzle didn't fit. Why did April keep these letters? Why didn't her mother throw them away? And why did Huntley continue to write congratulations, sign cards, as if nothing had changed? He remembered April mentioning Huntley once. It was about 5 years ago at some dinner. She said he was an old acquaintance who helped her with work when she was young. Garrett didn't think much of it at the time. Now he regretted not asking more. The day at the construction site passed slowly. Garrett pretended to be working, checking the drawings, giving orders to the workers, but his thoughts were somewhere else. He was thinking about how to return home, how to look April in the eyes, how not to give yourself away, because he knew that if he said something now, if he showed that he knew, she would find a way to get out. April always had a way with words. She knew how to convince. She knew how to make him feel guilty, even when he wasn't. By lunchtime, he called home. April didn't answer right away, and her voice was slightly annoyed. "What?" she asked. "Just making sure everything is okay," he said, trying to keep his voice normal. "Are you home?" "Yes," she answered. "I'm preparing dinner. Logan will come in the evening. Emma is with a friend. Okay, Garrett said. I'll be there by 7. She muttered something in response and hung up. Garrett looked at the phone, feeling something dark boiling inside him. He didn't want to hate her. I didn't want to become a person who seeks revenge. But he couldn't just forget. I couldn't pretend that nothing had happened. In the evening, returning home, Garrett noticed that April was acting as usual. She set the table, turned on the TV, even smiled at him when he entered. Logan was sitting on the couch, staring at his phone, and Emma hadn't returned yet. Everything looked as it should. It's as if nothing has changed. But for Garrett, it was different. He looked at April, at her neatly styled hair, at her smile, and saw not his wife, but a woman who was writing letters to another man, who lied to him, who may never have loved him as much as he loved her. "Are you okay?" she asked, placing a plate of fried chicken on the table. "Yes," he answered, without looking into her eyes. "It's just a hard day." She nodded, and the conversation died down. Logan was talking about college, but Garrett was barely listening. His thoughts were in that box, in those letters, in that signature that connected his wife with another man. After dinner, he said that he would go to the garage to check his tools. In fact, he wanted to be alone. In the garage, he sat down on an old chair, took out one of the letters he had taken with him, and reread it. "You say you love him, but I know that part of you belongs to me." Garrett clenched the letter in his fist, but did not tear it. Instead, he put it in his pocket and returned to the house. April was already clearing the table. She looked at him, and for a second it seemed to him that something flashed in her eyes, fear, suspicion, maybe guilt. But she quickly turned away. "Are you going to bed?" she asked. "Soon," he replied. "We need to make a couple of calls." She nodded and went upstairs. Garrett remained in the living room, looking at the family photographs on the wall. He knew he wouldn't be able to sleep. Not today. Not now that the truth had begun to emerge through the cracks of their lives. He took out his phone and typed the name into the search engine. Brad Huntley. News, photographs, articles. A person who was part of his family without being in it. A man who probably knew April better than he did. Garrett closed his eyes and inhaled. Garrett Sloan sat in his garage, surrounded by the smell of machine oil and old wood. The light from a single light bulb overhead cast harsh shadows on the concrete floor. He held one of the letters in his hands, but did not read it. His gaze was directed somewhere into the void, to where memories began to come to life, like old films that someone decided to replay. Brad Huntley's letters, found yesterday, revealed something in his soul, not only pain, but also questions. How could he not notice? How could he be so blind? He closed his eyes, and the past flooded into his mind, bright and painful, like sunlight after a long night. 1996, Boise, Idaho. Garrett was young, 29 years old, strong, with hands roughened from working in construction, and a heart that still believed in simple things: work, honesty, family. He was not a romantic, but in the depths of his soul, he dreamed of a home where it would be warm, where there would be someone worth coming back for. That evening, he walked into a bar, a place that smelled of beer and played country music, not looking for an adventure, just looking for a drink after a long day. She stood at the bar, laughing at something the bartender said. April Wilson. Her dark hair was pulled back into a messy ponytail, her blue eyes sparkled, and her smile. That smile could stop time. Garrett noticed her immediately, but did not approach her. Women like her seemed to him from another world, a world where people speak smart words and wear expensive things. He was just a guy from a construction site. But she herself turned to him. Their eyes met, and she smiled not just politely, but as if she had known him all her life. "Do you always look at strangers like that?" she asked, tilting her head. Garrett felt the blood rush to his face. He wasn't ready for this. "Only if they look like they could steal my beer," he replied, and she laughed. Her laughter was light as the wind, and at that moment he realized that he was lost. They talked all evening. April said that she works for a small PR company, that she loves books and hates getting up early. She was witty, lively, and Garrett, who usually couldn't carry on a conversation, suddenly found himself not wanting the evening to end. When the bar began to empty, he offered to walk her to her car. "You don't look like the locals," she said as they walked along the dark street. "In a good way. And you look like someone who knows what she wants," he replied. She stopped and looked at him. There was something in her eyes that he could not understand, then a mixture of curiosity and something else, deeper. "Maybe so," she said quietly. "But sometimes even I don't know what I want." He didn't ask what she meant. Instead, he wrote down her number on the napkin she pressed into his hand and watched her drive away in her old Ford. He didn't sleep that night thinking about her. April Wilson, a name he repeated to himself like a prayer. They started dating. Everything was swift, like summer rain. April was the one who set the pace. She called, set up dates, took him to concerts or outings that he had never thought about before. Garrett didn't mind. He liked that she was so confident, bright, as if she knew where she was going. He was happy just to be there. But there were moments that he ignored then. For example, how she sometimes fell silent, looking into emptiness, as if her thoughts were somewhere far away, or how she avoided talking about her past. "Nothing interesting," she answered when he asked about her life before they met. Garrett didn't insist. He thought it didn't matter, that the past remains in the past. 6 months later, she introduced him to her mother, Ruth. Ruth was a strict but kind woman. She looked at Garrett as if she were buying something in a store. She nitpicked about the little things, but in the end, she approved. "You're a good guy," she said as April walked into the kitchen. "But she's not one to stop easily. Be ready." Garrett didn't understand what she meant at the time. He simply nodded and smiled. Ruth smiled back, but there was something in her eyes that he noticed only years later, going through memories, doubt, or a warning. In 1997, April proposed marriage. It wasn't like in the movies. They were sitting in her apartment, drinking cheap wine, and she suddenly said, "What if we get married?" Garrett froze, holding the glass in his hand. He loved her without question, without doubt. But her proposal took him by surprise. "Are you serious?" he asked. "Why not?" she answered with a shrug. "We're happy, aren't we?" He nodded. They were happy, or at least that's what he thought. 3 months later, they got married. The wedding was modest, a few friends, family, a couple dozen guests. April looked like she belonged on the cover of a magazine, and Garrett felt out of place in the rented suit. But when she took his hand and looked into his eyes, he forgot about everything. This was their day, their beginning. But now, sitting in the garage with Huntley's letters in his hands, Garrett remembered details that had seemed insignificant then, like how April insisted they move to Boise, closer to her mother. Garrett was then working in Pocatello. He had a good crew, stable orders. Moving meant starting all over again. He didn't want this, but April was adamant. "Mom isn't getting any younger," she said then, looking at him with that smile that always made him agree. "And then, Boise is an opportunity. For us. For our family." Garrett relented. He always gave in when it came to her. They moved, rented a small house, and he began looking for work. It was hard for the first months. They barely made ends meet. But April was there, supporting him, and he thought it was worth it. Now he wondered, what if moving wasn't for them? What if it was for her other life, which he knew nothing about? He remembered another moment, which then seemed trivial to him. A year after their wedding, April got a job at a PR agency that worked on the campaigns of local politicians. She was happy and said that this was her chance. Garrett was happy for her, although he did not understand why she was so often late at work. Sometimes she would return late, with the smell of wine on her lips, and say that she had been at a business dinner. He believed. Why not? She was his wife. He trusted her. But now he remembered how one day, when she returned home, she mentioned Brad Huntley. It was casual, in between. "You know, Brad Huntley was at the event today," she said, taking off her shoes. "He's so charismatic. Everyone listens to him, spellbound." Garrett didn't pay attention then. He was tired, had just returned from construction, and all he wanted was to have dinner and go to bed. But now her words sounded different. Charismatic, spellbound. Was she one of them? Was she already with him then? Garrett opened his eyes, returning to reality. The garage was as cold and dark as his thoughts. He looked at the letter he still held in his hands. You said you were marrying him. I don't believe you're happy. Huntley's words burned like hot metal. Garrett tried to remember April in those early years. Was she happy? He thought so. She smiled, laughed, and made plans. But what if it was a game? What if she married him not out of love, but out of convenience? He remembered another conversation that seemed strange to him then. It was shortly after the birth of Logan, their first son. April was tired, but happy, or so it seemed. One night, when Logan was crying and Garrett was trying to calm him down, she suddenly said, "You're a good father, Garrett, and a good husband. But sometimes I think, what if I'm not who you think I am?" He then laughed, thinking she was joking. Postpartum fatigue, nothing more. "You are my wife," he said, kissing her forehead. "That's enough." She smiled, but her smile was empty. Now he saw it clearly. How could he be so blind? Garrett folded the letter and put it back in the box. His thoughts were chaotic, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't just forget. Can't pretend nothing happened. But he also knew that he couldn't just ask her. April was smart. If he shows his cards too early, she will find a way to explain everything. Or blame him. She always knew how to turn everything upside down. He stood up, feeling his legs go numb. The garage was his sanctuary, a place where he could think. But now, even here, he felt like a stranger. He looked at the old workbench, where his tools lay: a hammer, screwdrivers, a level. All he could do was with his hands. Build, repair, create. But how do you fix what's broken inside? How to rebuild your life if the foundation turned out to be a lie? He heard the door open. April stood in the doorway, her silhouette illuminated by the light from the house. "You're taking too long," she said, crossing her arms. "Everything is fine." Garrett looked at her, and for a second he wanted to drop everything: the letters, the photographs, the questions, and just hug her. Tell them they can handle it. But he couldn't. Not now. "Yes," he answered, hiding the box behind the workbench. "Just taking apart the tools." She nodded, but her gaze lingered on him a little longer than necessary, as if she was looking for something in his face. Then she turned and went back into the house. Garrett stared after her, feeling something inside him break. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew there was no turning back. Garrett Sloan stood at the kitchen window, looking out into the backyard, where the grass was already beginning to turn yellow from the November cold. He held a mug of cold coffee in his hands, but didn't drink. He just squeezed it like an anchor so as not to get lost in his own thoughts. A week had passed since he found Brad Huntley's letters, and every minute since then had been like walking on thin ice. He didn't say a word to April. He didn't show that he knew. But this silence did not bring peace. It grew like a shadow, filling the house, their conversations, their views. April was sitting at the table, scrolling through something on her tablet. Her fingers moved quickly, confidently, as if she were in her own world, where everything was under control. Garrett looked at her and tried to find the woman he had loved for 25 years. The one who laughed at his jokes, who held his hand when Logan was born, who cried on his shoulder when her father died. But now he saw only the mask. Or maybe the mask was always there, but he just didn't notice. "You're silent again," she said, without looking up from the screen. Her voice was level, but there was a hint of annoyance in it. "Is something wrong?" Garrett forced himself to turn away from the window and look at her. Her blue eyes met his gaze, but there was no warmth in them. Just waiting. It was as if she was testing him. "It's okay," he answered, trying to keep his voice calm. "I'm just tired." She nodded, but her lips pursed slightly, a subtle sign he knew all too well. April didn't like it when he was silent. She always said that his silence was a wall that she could not break through. But now he was silent not because he did not want to talk. He remained silent because he was afraid that the truth would come out before he was ready. "Logan called," she said, returning to the tablet. He said he would come for the weekend, but he seems to be in the mood again. Garrett felt something tighten in his chest. Logan, his son, 19 years old, a college freshman, the guy who once looked up to him as a hero. Now Logan could barely speak to him. Short phrases, evasive glances, sarcastic remarks. Garrett thought it was just teenage rebellion that dragged on. But now he wondered, what if it wasn't just age? What if April is setting him up? What does "in the mood" mean? He asked, putting the mug on the table. April shrugged without looking up. You know Logan. He is angry at the whole world. And well, you don't really try to talk to him. Garrett felt something hot boiling inside. Is he not trying? He called Logan every week, who suggested going fishing, watching football, just talking. But Logan was always busy, or not in the mood, or I just didn't want to. Maybe he's angry because someone is adding fuel to the fire, Garrett said, his voice sounding harsher than he intended. April looked up, her eyebrows raised slightly. What do you mean? He looked at her, and for a second he wanted to say everything. About letters, about Huntley, about how she lied to him all these years. But he clenched his jaw and forced himself to remain silent. Not now. Not like that. Nothing, he said finally. Forget. She looked at him for another second, then returned to the tablet. But Garrett noticed how her fingers froze on the screen. She knew he was hiding something, and he knew she was hiding much more. In the afternoon, Garrett went to a construction site. Work was his refuge where he could focus on something real. Blueprints, concrete, steel beams. But even there his thoughts returned to April, to the letters, to Huntley. He began to notice little things that he had previously ignored. For example, how often April has been away on business in recent months. How she began to mention work more often, although she rarely talked about it before. How she began to avoid his touch not harshly, but enough for him to notice. At a construction site, his partner, Dan, noticed that he was out of action. Where are you, Sloan? He asked, wiping sweat from his forehead. The second day, it's as if you're not here. Garrett forced himself to smile. Everything is fine. Just. Family matters. Dan chuckled, but didn't ask questions. He knew Garrett enough not to pry into his soul. Instead, he suggested they have a beer after work, but Garrett refused. He needed to go home, not because he wanted to see April, but because he had to watch. At home, everything was as usual, and it was killing him. April was preparing dinner, humming something under her breath. Emma, their 15-year-old daughter, sat in the living room, staring at her phone. She looked like her mother, the same blue eyes, the same sharp chin. But unlike April, Emma was as open as a book, or at least it used to be. In recent months, she also began to withdraw. Not as harsh as Logan, but Garrett felt it. Her "Hi, Dad" became shorter, her smiles became less frequent. Emma, he called, sitting down on the sofa next to her. How are you? She looked up from the phone and shrugged. Fine, she said, her voice as indifferent as Logan's. Garrett tried to smile. School? Friends? Everything is fine? Yes, Dad, it's okay, she answered, and there was something in her tone that cut him. Not anger, not irritation, but fatigue. It was as if she didn't want this conversation, as if he was superfluous. He opened his mouth to say something else, but April called them to dinner. Emma immediately jumped up, leaving him alone on the couch. Garrett stared after her, feeling something inside him crack. His daughter, his baby, who once fell asleep in his arms, who drew him Father's Day cards. Now she looked at him as if he were a stranger. Dinner was quiet. April was talking about her work, some new project related to city events. Garrett listened with half an ear, nodding when necessary. Emma picked at her food, occasionally answering her mother's questions. Garrett tried to talk to her, but every time he ran into a wall. Yes, Dad. Fine. Don't know. When April left to wash the dishes, he remained at the table, looking at Emma. If something is wrong, you can tell, he said quietly. I'm always there, you know. Emma looked at him, and for a second he thought she wanted to say something. But then she looked away. It's okay, Dad, she repeated and went to her room. Garrett was left alone. He heard April rattling dishes in the kitchen and a door slamming somewhere upstairs. His house, his family, but he felt like a guest who had forgotten to invite me. At night, he lay in bed, looking at the ceiling. April was sleeping next to her. Her breathing was even calm. He looked at her face, illuminated by the faint light of the moon, and tried to remember the last time they spoke for real. Not about bills, not about children, not about work. About them. About what connected them. But such conversations have not happened for a long time. Maybe years. He turned on his side, away from her, and closed his eyes. But sleep did not come. Instead, fragments of memories swirled around in his head. Logan, who refused to go fishing with him because it's boring. Emma, who stopped hugging him before bed. April, who increasingly retreated into her own world, leaving him outside. And letters. The damned letters that he hid in the garage like a ticking bomb. The next day, Logan arrived home. Garrett heard his voice from the threshold sharp, with a hint of irritation. He walked into the living room, where Logan stood arguing with April about something. "I told you I don't need your help," Logan said, throwing his backpack on the sofa. "I'll figure it out myself." "Logan, I just want you to not do anything stupid," April replied, her voice calm but steely in it. Garrett walked into the room and Logan fell silent, looking at him. There was something in his gaze that Garrett couldn't make out, a mixture of anger and shame. "Hi, son," Garrett said, trying to smile. "Glad to see you." Logan nodded but didn't answer. Instead, he took his backpack and headed towards the stairs. "I'm in my room," he said without turning around. Garrett looked at April. She sighed and shook her head. "He's just tired," she said. "Give him time." But Garrett knew it wasn't fatigue. He saw Logan looking at him, how Emma looks away, how April talks to him but doesn't say anything. It wasn't just distance, it was an abyss, and he didn't know how to overcome it. In the evening, he went to the garage again. It became his ritual to hide there, among the tools and old boxes, where he could think. He took out one of the letters and reread it. "You say you love him, but I know that part of you belongs to me." Huntley's words were like poison that slowly spread through his veins. Garrett tried to understand what April saw in this man. Money, power, or something else that he, Garrett, couldn't give her. He heard footsteps and quickly hid the letter. The garage door opened and Logan walked in. His son looked tired, with dark circles under his eyes. He stopped, looking at Garrett. "What are you doing here?" Logan asked, his voice harsh, almost accusing. "I'm just thinking," Garrett replied, trying not to give himself away. "And you?" Logan shrugged. "Mom said you've been sitting here all day. It's like you're hiding." Garrett felt something prick in his chest. "You're hiding, maybe so, but not from them, from the truth. Sometimes you need to be alone," he said. "You know." Logan looked at him, and for a second Garrett thought he wanted to say something, but then his son turned away. "Whatever," he said and left. Garrett stared at the closed door, feeling his home, his family, his life slipping from his hands. He didn't know what to do, but he knew he couldn't just stand by and watch everything fall apart. He had to act. Garrett Sloan was sitting behind the wheel of his pickup truck, parked on the side of the road not far from his house. The engine was turned off, but he was in no hurry to get out. He held the phone in his hands, scrolling through April's call list, which he copied while she took a shower. 2 weeks have passed since he found the letters. 2 weeks of silence, of observation, of nights where he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling while April slept next to him, as if nothing had changed. He didn't ask her anything. Not because he was afraid of the answer, but because he knew that she would lie. April always knew how to speak in a way that made the truth seem like her ally. But now he saw the cracks in her words, in her looks, in her smiles, and he collected these cracks as evidence. This morning, everything changed. April returned from her run beaming as if she had won the lottery. She threw her sneakers at the door, walked into the kitchen, and, pouring herself some coffee, said, "I was offered a job, PR manager at the mayor's office. Garrett, standing at the stove with scrambled eggs, froze. The spatula in his hand paused, but he forced himself to continue, turning the food so she wouldn't notice his reaction. "City Hall?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "This is unexpected." "Yes," she answered, and her voice was full of enthusiasm that he had not heard for a long time. "They are looking for someone with experience in communications. They called yesterday and invited me to a meeting. This is a big step, Garrett. For us." He nodded without looking at her. "For us." These words cut like a knife. He knew it wasn't for them. It was for her, and perhaps for him. For Huntley. "Who called?" he asked, putting the frying pan on the table. April shrugged, taking a sip of her coffee. "Some guy from the HR department. I don't remember the name. He said that my resume was recommended to them." Garrett looked at her, trying to catch the lie. Her face was open, her smile was sincere. But he knew her too well. I knew how she looked away slightly when she was lying, as her fingers began to fiddle with the handle of the mug. It was all there, barely noticeable, but clear, like a signal. "Congratulations," he said, sitting down opposite. "This is great." She smiled wider, but her eyes didn't light up like before. She was hiding something, and he was going to find out exactly what. In the afternoon, Garrett went to the construction site, but the work was not going well. His thoughts were in April, on Huntley, on this proposal. City Hall. Brad Huntley was not the mayor, but his influence in Boise was enormous. He sat on the city council, appeared at all events, his name was widely known. If anyone could get April into this position, it was him. Garrett didn't believe in coincidences. Not now. During his lunch break, he locked himself in his trailer and took out the notebook he had started writing a couple of days ago. This was his attempt to put his thoughts in order. He recorded everything: April's calls, her absences, strange moments in her behavior. It was not a diary, more like a dossier. He felt like a detective in a cheap movie, but it helped. It helped me not to go crazy. He opened the phone and looked through her calls again. Yesterday evening, at 1942, there was an incoming call from an unfamiliar number. Lasted 3 minutes. Garrett copied the number and entered it into the search engine. Nothing. Just another mobile from Idaho. But he wrote it down in a notepad, next to the date and time. Then I opened her messages, the ones I could see before she changed her password. Nothing explicit, but one message from a colleague, Linda, caught his attention. "Are you sure you want to get involved in this? City Hall is no joke." April replied, "I know what I'm doing." Garrett wrote this down in his notebook, emphasizing the word sure. He leaned back in his chair, looking at his notes. This was not proof, not evidence, but this was the beginning. He knew he had to be careful. If April realizes he's digging, she'll shut down. Or worse, he will turn everything around so that he turns out to be guilty. She'd done this before, not with things this big, but with little things. When Logan was little, she accused Garrett of being too strict after he punished her son for fighting at school. Now he saw it clearly. She was manipulating. And perhaps she always did. In the evening, April left for a meeting. She said it was for work, but did not specify with whom or where. Garrett didn't ask. Instead, he waited until her car was around the corner and pulled out his laptop. He knew he was invading her personal space, but guilt had long since given way to determination. He opened her email. He guessed the password a couple of days ago, after several attempts. It was simpler than he expected: their wedding date. The irony was not lost on him. "There was a letter in my inbox that was sent yesterday. Topic: invitation to an interview. The sender is a certain David Crow, an employee of the mayor's office." The text was formal. "Dear Mrs. Sloan, we are impressed with your resume and would like to discuss the opportunity to work as a PR manager." Garrett read it twice, looking for a catch. Nothing unusual, except for one thing. At the end of the letter, there was the phrase, "on the recommendation of our colleague." The colleague's name was not mentioned. Garrett copied the letter into his notebook, word for word. He closed his laptop and looked at his watch. April won't be home for another couple of hours. Enough time to check a few more things. He went down to the garage, where he hid the box of Huntley's letters. He hadn't touched her since last week, but now he felt like he had to come back. Maybe there was something there that he missed. He opened the box and took out one of the last letters, dated 2005. Logan was 3 at the time. Emma had not yet been born. The letter was short, but its tone was different from the previous ones. Huntley wrote, "April, I know you're busy with your family, but I can't stop thinking about you. If you ever need help with work, with anything, you know where to find me. I'll always be there. B." Garrett reread the line about work. With anything. This was not just an offer of support. This was the thread that could connect Huntley with this new proposal. He wrote down the date of the letter and its contents in a notebook, adding a note, "Check Huntley's connections with the mayor's office." When April returned home, Garrett was in the living room, pretending to watch TV. She walked in, throwing her bag on the sofa, and smiled at him. "How was the meeting?" he asked without looking up from the screen. "Great," she replied, sitting down next to him. "They are serious. I think this is my chance." "Cool," he said, forcing himself to smile. "Who was at the meeting?" She hesitated, just for a split second, but he noticed. "Just a couple of people from HR," she said. "And, ordinary bureaucrats." He nodded, but questions were already swirling in his head. Why didn't she name names? Why did her voice become a little quieter? He didn't press. Instead, he changed the subject, asking about Emma, who was again staying with a friend. April replied, but her mind seemed to be elsewhere. The next day, he began to act more actively. In the morning, while April was jogging, he installed an application on her phone, a tracker that showed her location. It wasn't difficult. She never locked her phone when she left it on charge. Garrett felt disgusted, but justified himself by saying that the truth was more important. He also started checking her social media, although April rarely posted anything. But he noticed that she had recently added several people associated with the mayor's office as friends. One of them was David Crow, the one who sent the letter. Garrett wrote his name down on a notepad, adding, "Check with Huntley." At a construction site, he approached Dan, his partner, who knew everyone and everything in boys. "Have you heard anything about Brad Huntley?" he asked, trying to make the question sound casual. Dan chuckled, wiping his hands with a rag. "This slippery guy? Yes, he sticks his nose everywhere. They say that half the seats in the mayor's office are his people. And what?" "Just curious," Garrett replied with a shrug. "I heard there are some changes there." Dan nodded, but did not pursue the topic. Garrett didn't insist. He got what he wanted, confirmation that Huntley had influence. By the end of the week, Garrett had collected enough to begin to see the picture. April had met someone downtown twice in the past 3 days. The tracker showed she was at a cafe near City Hall. She did not mention these meetings. He sat in the garage, going through his notes. The notebook was already half full. Dates, numbers, names, quotes. On the screen was a recording from the camera he installed in the garage 3 days ago. A small, cheap thing, bought online for $30, hidden behind an old workbench. The recording was short, just a few minutes. The camera turned on the motion sensor at 19:23 last night. April walked into the garage, holding the phone to her ear. She spoke quietly, but Garrett could make out a few words. "Yes, tomorrow, I'll come." She looked wary, looking around, as if she was afraid that someone was watching. Then she left the garage, and a minute later the camera recorded how a black SUV drove up to their house. April got into the car, and she drove off. Garrett rewinded the recording and stopped at the point where the license plate of the SUV was visible. It was blurry, but partially readable, E7. He wrote it down in his notebook, which was already full of notes, calls, messages, dates. Then I opened the number checking site and entered what I could make out. Nothing. Too little data. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. April said yesterday that she was going to see her friend Linda. "Girls get together," she called it, smiling that smile that once made his heart beat faster. Now that smile seemed like a mask to him. He didn't believe her, but didn't argue. Instead, I waited until she left and checked her phone logs through the app I installed a week ago. She didn't call Linda, but there was a call to a number that he had already seen before, the same one with a 3-minute conversation before the offer from the mayor's office. Garrett recorded the time, 7:15 p.m., 8 minutes before she entered the garage. At home, April behaved as if nothing had happened. She was preparing dinner, humming some of the old Taylor Swift songs that Emma loved so much. Garrett sat at the table, pretending to read the news on his phone. In fact, he was watching her. The way she moves, the way she speaks, the way she avoids his gaze. Everything about her was familiar, but now he saw her differently, like a shadow on a wall, close, but intangible. "How was your meeting with Linda?" he asked, trying to make his voice sound casual. April paused for a second, stirring the sauce on the stove. Her shoulders tensed, but she quickly relaxed. "Oh, okay," she answered without turning around. "You know Linda. He talks incessantly. We sat in the cafe until 9. Garrett nodded, feeling his stomach tighten. Cafe, until 9. He knew she was lying. The tracker on her phone showed that she was in the city center, 3 miles from the cafe where she allegedly met Linda, and now this entry is with an SUV. He wanted to grab her by the shoulders, shake her, ask who was in that car. But he clenched his fists under the table and remained silent. "Okay," he said. "Glad you had fun." She turned around and smiled. Her eyes were the same blue as always, but now he saw something new in them. Not warm, not love, caution. Emma came to dinner, but Logan was not there. He stayed at college, citing exams. Garrett looked at his daughter, trying to find in her at least a hint of the little girl who once drew hearts on paper for him. But Emma was as distant as a star. She sat with her face buried in the phone and answered in monosyllables. "How was school?" he asked, cutting off a piece of meat. "Fine," she muttered, without looking up. "Anything interesting?" He tried again. "Dad, it's okay," she said, and there was irritation in her voice. Garrett felt something prick in his chest. He wanted to tell her that he loved her, that he would always be there, but the words were stuck in his throat. Instead, he looked at April, who was watching them with a small smile. That smile cut him. It was as if she knew he was losing touch with the children, as if this was part of her plan. "Emma, put the phone away," April said, her voice soft, almost gentle. "Eat normally." Emma sighed, but obeyed. Garrett looked at them, at mother and daughter, and felt out of place. It was as if he was a guest in their world, not a father, not a husband, not part of the family. After dinner, Garrett went to the garage. He turned on the laptop and watched the recording again. Black foreign procurement. April getting into it. Her quick glance around. He saved the video to a flash drive, which he hid in a toolbox. Then I opened the phone logs. The number she called before getting into the car was registered to D. Crow. He looked up Crow on the internet. A man in his 40s, an employee of the mayor's office, was often mentioned near Huntley. In one of the photos, they were standing together at some event, both in suits, both with the same smiles. Garrett enlarged the photo, peering into Crow's face. Nothing remarkable. Just another pawn in the game he was sure Huntley was playing. He closed his laptop and looked at his hands. They were rough, calloused, stained with paint and cement. Builder's hands. The hands of a man who always believed that honesty and hard work were all that was needed. Now he wasn't so sure. Honesty did not help him see the truth. Labor did not save his family. The next day, April left again on business. Garrett didn't ask where. He just checked the tracker. She was in the same area where the black SUV was parked. He wrote down the time and place, adding to his notepad. Check camera again. Then I called Dan, my partner, who knew people at City Hall. "Have you heard about David Crow?" he asked, trying to make the question sound like chatter. "Crow?" Dan thought, chewing a sandwich. "Yes, he is from the Huntley team. Rumor has it that Huntley has him on a short leash." "And what?" "Nothing." Garrett just came across the article. Garrett Sloan sat in his garage, lit by a dim light that blinked as if he, too, was tired of everything. He held a pen and a blank sheet of paper in his hands, but the words did not come. He was not a man who wrote letters. I was not one to pour out my soul. But today he felt he had to. Not for myself, for Logan and Emma, for those who may soon stop looking at him as a father. He looked at the sheet. This was not a letter in the classical sense. Not, "Dear children, I love you." Garrett couldn't do that. It was more like a will, a note in case everything goes to hell. If April turned his life upside down, as he suspected, she could. He knew her. I knew how she could speak, smile, cry, so that everyone would believe. If he spilled everything now, the letters, the recording, his suspicions, she would make him paranoid in the eyes of the children, in the eyes of the court, in the eyes of everyone. He needed a plan, and this letter is his insurance. He began to write, slowly, squeezing out words like toothpaste from an empty tube. Logan, Emma, if you're reading this, it means I couldn't tell you everything myself. Not because I didn't want to, because I didn't know how. You are my children, and everything I did was for you. Even if you now think that I am a stranger, I'm not perfect. I never have. But I've always been honest. With you. With you. With your mother. Now I know things that change everything. About her. About our family. I don't want you to hate her. But I want you to know the truth. Not the one she will tell you. Mine. If I'm wrong, burn this letter. If not, decide for yourself what to do about it. In the afternoon, he returned to the construction site. Work helped distract me, but did not drown out my thoughts. He thought about how to proceed. Garrett Sloan sped down the highway, gripping the steering wheel as if it could keep his life from falling apart. The wind beat through the half-open window, drowning out the radio he had turned on to distract himself. It didn't help. His thoughts were like a swarm of wasps. Huntley's letters, the black SUV, April's lies, the coldness in Emma's eyes, Logan's alienation. All of this was running through his mind as he rode to the man who could perhaps give him a chance to regain control. To Jack Hayes, lawyer. Jack wasn't one to wear expensive suits or talk pompously, but he knew the law and knew how to keep his mouth shut. Garrett parked at a small office on the outskirts of Boise. He entered, carrying with him a plastic bag containing his evidence, a flash drive with a recording from the garage, copies of Huntley's letters, printouts of telephone logs, a notebook with notes. It was his weapon, but for now it looked like a pile of junk. Jack could turn this into something more. "Sloan, damn it," Jack said, getting up from the table. He was balding, with a slight paunch, but his eyes were sharp, like a hawk's. "What happened?" Garrett tossed the bag onto the table and sat down, feeling the fatigue hit him like a concrete slab. "April," he said briefly. "She's lying to me. For a long time now, and I want to be ready if everything falls apart." Jack narrowed his eyes, but did not interrupt. He opened the package, dumped the contents, and began leafing through it. Letters, flash drive, notepad. His eyebrows slowly rose. "What, are you a private detective now?" he asked, but there was no mockery in his voice. "Seriously, Garrett, explain." Garrett told everything. About the letters I found from my mother-in-law. About Huntley, whose name popped up everywhere like a bad joke. About the recording with the SUV. About April's lie about meeting a friend. About her new job at the mayor's office, which smelled like a setup. He spoke evenly, without emotion, as if he was reporting at a construction site. But inside he was shaking. Jack listened, nodding, occasionally making notes in his notebook. "Okay," he said when Garrett had finished. "You collected more than I expected. But here's the thing. Most of this is circumstantial evidence. The letters are old, the camera footage doesn't prove cheating, and the phone logs. Well, they show she called someone, so what? The judge will look at this and say, 'Where are the facts? Do you want a divorce?'" Garrett clenched his jaw. Divorce. The word sounded like a gunshot. He wasn't ready to answer. Not because he still loved April, he no longer knew how he felt, but because of the children. Logan and Emma were his anchor, and he was afraid that a divorce would cut them off from him forever. 100% yes, But I want to be ready, he said finally. I don't want to be left empty-handed, and I want the children to know the truth, not her version. Jack nodded, tapping his pen on the table. Fine. Then we do this. They discussed plans for another hour. And one more thing, Jack added, looking into his eyes. If it comes to court, you will need to look clean. No disruptions, no threats. Judges love nice guys. Can you be like that? Garrett chuckled. Nice guy. He built houses, paid taxes, and raised children. But now he felt like a wolf driven into a corner. I can handle it, he said. Jack smiled, but the smile was tired. Then let's get to work. Let's clean up this mess. They sat for 2 hours. Jack sorted the evidence like poker cards. He put Huntley's letters aside, too old to be significant, but useful for context. He copied the footage of the SUV onto his computer and suggested hiring a private detective to track the car. Garrett refused. He didn't want to spend the money until he was sure. Jack noted telephone logs and messages from Crow as a priority. They could prove April's connection with Huntley through the mayor's office. Here's what we do, Jack said, pushing a sheet of bullet points towards him. You continue to follow, but carefully. In the meantime, I'll check on Crow and Huntley. What if she serves first? He asked, looking at Jack. What if she's already getting ready? Jack shrugged. Then we will be ready. You have me, and you have this. He nodded at the dossier. She may be smart, but we will be smarter. Garrett nodded. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he wasn't alone. It didn't take away the pain, but it did give purpose. He wasn't going to just watch his life fall apart. He will fight, not with fists, not with screams. Smart, cold, in a way she doesn't expect. When he returned home, April was in the living room, talking on the phone. Her voice was soft, almost flirtatious, and it cut through Garrett like a knife. She noticed him and quickly ended the conversation, saying, I'll call you later. Who called? He asked, hanging up his jacket. Linda, she answered without looking at him. I asked about work. Lie. He knew it. The tracker showed that she had not been to Linda's for a week, but he didn't argue. Instead, he nodded and walked into the kitchen. Emma was at home, but as usual, she locked herself in her room. Garrett knocked, but she shouted, I'm busy. He didn't insist. Logan sent a message that he would be staying at college for another week. Business, he wrote. The next day, he met with Bart, the same guy from City Hall that Dan was talking about. They were sitting in a diner on the outskirts, where there was a smell of frying onions and coffee. Bart was skinny and had a nervous look, but he spoke willingly. Huntley, he asked, taking a sip of beer. This guy is like a spider. Everything that moves in City Hall goes through it. Curo is his right-hand man. If your wife got a job there, it's not an accident. Huntley doesn't give gifts just for the sake of it. What do you mean? Garrett asked, clutching his mug. Bart leaned closer, lowering his voice. There are rumors that he is sleeping with half of the PR department. I don't know if it's true or not, but if your April is on the case, she either knows what she's gotten herself into or she's being used. Garrett nodded, feeling the blood pounding in his temples. The last few days have been like running through a minefield. He followed April through the tracker, checked her calls, and added new entries to the dossier. Yesterday, she received a text from David Crow. Tomorrow, 2 p.m., Blue River. He will be there. Garrett wasn't sure who he was, but he was betting on Huntley. This was his chance, not just to collect evidence, but to catch them on something real, in words that cannot be refuted. He looked at his watch, 13:55. The cafe was visible across the road, a cozy place with large windows, serving coffee and cakes. April walked in there 5 minutes ago alone. She sat by the window, scrolling through her phone, her dark hair glistening in the sunlight. Garrett felt his heart pounding in his chest, but he forced himself to breathe evenly. He waited. At 2:02 p.m., a black SUV, the same one with a license plate he couldn't quite make out, parked at the cafe. Brad Huntley came out. Garrett recognized him immediately, tall, in a dark blue suit, with the same self-confident smile as on the billboards. Huntley straightened his jacket and entered the cafe. Garrett started recording on his phone, put it in his shirt pocket, and got out of the car. It's time. The inside of the cafe smelled of freshly brewed coffee and cinnamon. Garrett walked to the counter, pretending to study the menu. April and Huntley sat in the corner, by the window. Their voices were quiet, but they reached him. He ordered coffee without looking in their direction and took a table nearby, turning around so that he could see them out of the corner of his eye. His phone, hidden in his pocket, recorded everything. "Long time no see," Huntley said, his voice smooth as expensive whiskey. "You look amazing, April." "Thank you," she replied, and Garrett detected a slight smile in her tone. "You too. Haven't changed." Huntley laughed, and the laugh cut Garrett like a knife. He clutched the mug, trying not to give himself away. The waitress brought the coffee, and he nodded, not taking his eyes off the menu, which he held in his hands like a shield. "Remember the old days?" said Huntley, lowering his voice. "When everything was simpler. You, me, those evenings by the river." April fell silent, and Garrett felt the air in the cafe become heavier. He couldn't see her face, but he knew she was smiling. Or maybe he's nervous. He wanted to turn around, but restrained himself. "Brad, don't start," she finally said, but there was no anger in her voice. More like something warm. It was a long time ago. "Not that long ago," Huntley replied, his tone becoming more serious. "You're free now, April. Finally, no need to pretend." Garrett froze. Free. The word hit like a hammer. He felt the blood rush to his face, but forced himself to sit still. His hand in his pocket squeezed the phone, making sure it was recording. This was what he needed. Something Jack can use. "I'm not free," April said, but her voice was quieter, as if she wasn't sure. "I have a family, Brad, children." "The children are adults," Huntley replied, and there was steel in his words. "And Garrett, he never understood you. Not like me." Garrett clenched his teeth. He wanted to get up, walk over, and punch Huntley so hard he would forget his name. But he didn't move. Not now. Not here. He took a sip of coffee, although it was as bitter as his thoughts. "You always knew how to talk," April said, a hint of mockery in her voice. "But I'm not the girl who ran after you." "Maybe not," Huntley replied, "but you're still here, with me." Garrett felt something inside him break. He couldn't listen anymore. It was time to act. He stood up, holding his mug, and walked towards their table, pretending that he had just noticed them. "April," he said, stopping. His voice was calm, but inside he was seething. "I didn't know you were here." April flinched, her eyes widening. Huntley turned, and his smile became a little more intense. "Garrett," April said, quickly gaining control of herself. "What are you?" "I thought you were at a construction site." "Finished early," he replied, looking at Huntley. "I decided to drink coffee. And this?" Huntley stood up, holding out his hand. His movements were confident, but Garrett saw his gaze flicker to April. "Brad Huntley," he said. "Nice to meet you. You must be April's husband." Garrett shook his hand, squeezing it a little harder than necessary. Huntley didn't flinch, but his smile grew colder. "Yeah," Garrett said. "Garrett Sloan. Are you a colleague?" "You could say that," Huntley replied, sitting back down. "April and I were discussing her new role at City Hall. I'm consulting on the project." Garrett nodded, looking at April. Her face was calm, but he saw how her fingers clenched the napkin. "Cool," he said, smiling. "I won't interfere. See you at home, April." He turned and walked away to his table, feeling their gaze on his back. His heart was pounding, but he controlled himself. He finished his coffee, paid, and left without looking back. He took out his phone and texted Jack, "There is a recording. Huntley and April need to discuss." Then he hid the phone and closed his eyes. Garrett Sloan sat in the living room, looking at the family photos on the wall. Logan at graduation, Emma with her first guitar, his and April's wedding. All of this was like footage from someone else's life. After yesterday's meeting in the cafe, after Huntley's words about old times and freedom, he felt that the time of silence was over. The recording he made burned in his pocket like a hot coal. Jack, his lawyer, said it wouldn't be enough for a trial, but it would be enough for a conversation. And Garrett decided to start with those for whom he did all this with Logan and Emma. He knew it was a risk. The kids were already moving away, especially Logan, whose calls were getting shorter and their looks were getting colder. Emma, although she was closer, also closed herself off like a shell. But he couldn't wait any longer. April was playing her game, and he suspected that she was turning them against him. If he doesn't tell the truth now, she will do it for him in her version where he will be a monster. Logan arrived home on Saturday, leaving his backpack at the door, looking like he'd been forced to show up at gunpoint. Emma was upstairs in her room, but Garrett knew she would come down if called. April left for a meeting, again a lie, according to the tracker, which showed that she was downtown, in the same area where the black SUV was. This gave him a window, an hour, maybe two, enough to get started. "Logan," Garrett called, standing by the stairs. "Come down. We need to talk." Logan appeared a minute later, his face a mixture of irritation and fatigue. He plopped down on the sofa, crossing his arms. "What?" he asked without looking at his father. "I just arrived, Dad. Give me a break." Garrett clenched his jaw, but held back. He didn't want to start with a conflict. "Not with my son." "Emma!" he shouted upstairs. "Come here." Emma came down slowly, headphones in hand. Her blue eyes, so similar to April's, were wary. "What's happened?" she asked, sitting down next to Logan. Garrett looked at them, his children, his blood, his everything. He felt the words getting stuck in his throat, but he forced himself to speak. "I want you to know what's going on," he began, sitting down opposite. "Between me and your mother. Everything is not as it seems." Logan rolled his eyes. "Seriously, Dad, your quarrels again. Maybe just figure it out, huh?" "This is not a fight," Garrett said, his voice becoming firmer. "This is true. I found something, letters, old ones, from the person your mother was close with, before me, and it looks like it's not over yet." Emma frowned, her fingers tightening around her headphones. "What kind of letters?" she asked quietly. Logan snorted. "Are you kidding? Are you going through her things?" "That's low, Dad." Garrett took out his phone and opened a photo of one of Huntley's letters. He didn't want to show the originals, they were in the garage in the file. But the copy was clear enough. He handed the phone to Logan. "Read it," he said. "These are not my words. This is her past." Logan took the phone, but his gaze was full of skepticism. He skimmed the text, then threw the phone on the sofa. "And what?" he said. "It was 100 years ago. Are you going to judge her for this now? She's with you, Dad, not with some dude from the letter." Garrett felt anger flare up in his chest, but he held it in. He expected this. Logan always protected April, always been her boy. "It's not just the past," he said, looking into his son's eyes. "She's dating him. Now. I saw it. I have a recording." Emma leaned forward, her face turning pale. "What recording?" she asked, and there was fear in her voice. Garrett wanted to show the video, but stopped. "Not now. Not like that." He didn't want to hurt her. Logan is different. He's an adult. He should understand. But Emma, she was still a child. "I'll show you if you need to," he said, looking at Logan. "But I want you to know that I'm not lying. I'm not paranoid. I'm trying to protect us. All of us." Logan stood up, his face red. "This is nonsense, Dad. You're spying on your mom like some kind of crazy person. She works, she tries, and you just can't come to terms with it. Maybe you're the one pushing her away." Garrett stood up, his voice lower but firmer. "Logan, I'm not spying. I'm looking for the truth. And if you think I made it up, ask her. Ask who Brad Huntley is. See how she responds." Logan opened his mouth, but couldn't find the words. He grabbed his backpack and headed towards the door. "I won't listen to this," he said. "You're crazy." The door slammed and Garrett was left with Emma. She looked at him. Her eyes were full of questions, But she was silent. He wanted to hug her and tell her that everything would be fine, but he couldn't. Not now. "Emma," he began, but she shook her head. "I don't know, Dad," she said quietly. I don't know." She got up and went upstairs, leaving him alone. The house was filled with silence, heavy as concrete. Garrett sat down on the sofa, feeling tired. He took the first step, and he failed. But he wasn't going to stop. April returned an hour later. Garrett heard her car drive up and the door slam. She walked in, throwing her bag on the floor, and immediately felt the tension. Her gaze darted to him, then to the stairs, where Emma had locked herself in the room. "What's happened?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Logan called. He said you were organizing some kind of circus." Garrett looked at her, and for a second he wanted to throw everything in her face, the letters, the recording, the truth. But he knew she was ready. She's always ready. "I talked to them," he said, trying to keep his voice even. "About us. About what's happening." Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't flinch. "What did you tell them?" she asked, coming closer. "Why are you digging into my past again?" "Garrett, this isn't funny anymore. You're paranoid." He stood up, feeling the rage boiling inside him. But he didn't scream, didn't give her a reason. "Paranoid?" he said quietly. "Then explain why you're lying." "About Linda, about meetings, about Huntley." Her face turned pale, but she quickly pulled herself together. She stepped towards him, her voice becoming louder, almost shrill. "Enough," she shouted. "You spy on me, rummage through my things, and now you're traumatizing children with your nonsense. Do you want to destroy the family? Is this what you are trying to achieve?" Garrett looked at her, and in her eyes he saw more than just anger. Fear. She was afraid. Not him. Truth. "I'm not destroying the family," he said, his voice as cold as steel. "I'm trying to save her." She opened her mouth, but found no words. Then she turned around and went upstairs, slamming the bedroom door. Garrett remained in the living room, listening to the house go silent. But it wasn't just silence. It was fear. He felt it in the air, in the walls, in himself. April was afraid he was close. Logan didn't believe it, but doubts had already arisen. Emma was silent, but she listened. Garrett Sloan stood at the sink, mechanically washing dishes after dinner. The plates slipped under his calloused fingers, the water splashed, but his thoughts were far away. A conversation with the children a week ago left a residue like dust at a construction site. Logan drove back to college without saying goodbye, his last words, "You're crazy, Dad," still ringing in his ears. Emma was silent, but her look, full of doubts, was worse than a scream. April played her own game, sometimes cold, sometimes too caring, as if she was trying to make amends for a guilt that she did not admit. The house became a minefield, and Garrett felt that every step could be his last. He didn't notice Emma entering the kitchen. Her steps were light, almost inaudible, but when he turned around, she was standing in the doorway, pale, with red eyes. Her phone shook in her hand, as if she didn't know whether to drop it or squeeze it harder. "Emma?" Garrett said, drying his hands with a towel. "What's happened?" She opened her mouth, but instead of words, a strangled sob escaped from her throat. She stepped forward, and Garrett instinctively caught her as she nuzzled into his chest. Her shoulders were shaking, tears soaking his shirt. He froze, not knowing what to do. Emma hadn't cried like that since she was 5 and lost her puppy. This was not just a whim. It was painful. "Hey, hey," he said quietly, stroking her hair. "What happened? Tell." She pulled away, wiping her face with her sleeve. Her eyes, the same blue as April's, were filled with a mixture of horror and anger. "I saw Mom," she said, her voice trembling. "Today, at the cafe. She was in the car, with some man. They kissed." Garrett felt the floor disappear from under his feet. He knew who she was talking about, knew whose car it was. Black SUV, Huntley, but he didn't show it. He didn't want Emma to see his rage. He didn't want her to think that he was enjoying her pain. "Are you sure?" he asked, trying to keep his voice even. Emma nodded, her lips trembling. "I was with Kate. We were coming from the cinema. I saw her car. I wanted to come up and say hello. And then she fell silent, swallowing. It wasn't you, Dad. It was someone else. Garrett sank into a chair, pulling Emma's hand to sit next to him. His mind was racing, but he forced himself to focus. Not in April, not on Huntley, on Emma, his daughter, who had just seen her world fall apart. "Tell me more," he said. "Where was it? When?" Emma sniffled, looking at the floor. "About 3, at Blue River. I didn't mean to peek, Dad, really, but I recognized her car. And then, he was there, tall, in a suit. They didn't see me. I just left." Garrett nodded, jotting down the details in his head. Blue River, the same cafe where he ran into April and Huntley. The tracker showed she was there today, but she said she was going to a meeting for work. Another lie. But now that was not the main thing. The main thing is Emma. "Listen," he said, taking her hand. Her fingers were cold as ice. "What you saw, it's hard. I know, but I want you to understand, it's not your fault, and not mine. This is her choice." Emma looked up, and there was so much pain in them that Garrett wanted to take her in his arms, like in childhood, and carry her away from all this. "Did you know?" she asked quietly. "You were talking about letters. Is this him?" Garrett hesitated. He didn't want to lie, but he didn't want to dump everything on her either. Not now. She was too fragile. "I suspected," he said. "I found old letters. I kept an eye on her because I felt something was wrong." Emma shook her head, tears rolling down her cheeks again. "Why does she do this?" she whispered. "We are her family. You have always been everything to her. How could she?" Garrett squeezed her hand, feeling his own pain welling up. But he didn't let her escape. Not in front of Emma. "Sometimes people do things we don't understand," he said. "I don't know why she does this. Maybe she doesn't know herself. But I want you to remember, I am here. For you. For Logan. Whatever happens." Emma looked at him, and for the first time in months, there was no wall in her gaze. There was no cold. She saw him not a stranger, not a dad who is always busy, but a father. She rushed to him, hugging him so tightly that he felt her heart beating through her thin jacket. It wasn't just a hug. It was a comeback. Present. "I don't want you to leave," she whispered, burying her face in his shoulder. "Don't leave us, Dad. Please." Garrett closed his eyes, stroking her back. His throat tightened, but he did not let his voice waver. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I promise." They sat like that for several minutes in the silence of the kitchen, which smelled of detergent and cold coffee. Garrett felt something inside him come to life. Not hope he stopped hoping a long time ago, but determination. Emma was with him. Not completely, not without pain, but it was there, and it was worth everything. April returned an hour later. Garrett heard her car drive up and the door slam. He sat in the living room. Emma went upstairs, saying that she wanted to be alone. He didn't stop her. She needed time. But he knew that a conversation with April was inevitable. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. She entered, throwing her bag on the sofa, and looked at him with slight surprise. "Aren't you at a construction site?" she asked, taking off her coat. "Took the day off," he answered, without looking up from the TV. His voice was calm, but inside he was seething. He knew where she was, knew with whom, and he knew that Emma had seen. April nodded, but her gaze lingered on him. She felt that something was wrong. Garrett saw it in her tense shoulders, in the way she fiddled with her sleeve. "Is Emma home?" she asked, heading towards the stairs. "Yes," he said, "but she's not in the mood." April stopped and turned around. "Did something happen?" Her voice was cautious, as if she was testing the waters. Garrett looked into her eyes, and for a second he wanted to say everything. About cafes, about an SUV, about Emma's tears. But he restrained himself. "Not now, not like that. Just teenage stuff," he said with a shrug. "You know." She nodded, but her gaze was wary. She went upstairs and Garrett heard her knock on Emma's door. He didn't know what they would talk about. I didn't know if Emma would tell the truth, but he knew April would feel the pressure, and this was his advantage. After Emma saw April with Huntley in the car, the house turned into a battlefield where no one was shooting, but everyone had their guns drawn. Emma became quieter, her gaze full of questions that she did not dare ask. Logan, returning from college, looked at Garrett with suspicion, but without the same anger as before. April played her role flawlessly, a caring mother, busy with work, slightly tired of her husband's paranoia. But Garrett saw the cracks. Her smiles were too forced, her answers too quick. She knew he was close, and he knew that she was afraid. He spoke to Jack, his lawyer, yesterday. Jack prepared the divorce papers. By 6 in the evening, the table was set. Pasta, salad, a bottle of wine for the adults, and lemonade for Emma. Logan arrived an hour ago, silently nodded to his father, and went to his room. Emma helped in the kitchen, but her movements were constrained, as if she was afraid of breaking something. April was the last to enter. Her hair was styled and her makeup was flawless, but her eyes showed tension. "This looks delicious," she said, sitting down at the table. Her voice was light, but Garrett caught the false note. "What is the reason?" "I just wanted to get everyone together," he replied, putting the plate of pasta on the table. "We haven't sat together for a long time." Logan came down, leaving his backpack at the door. He sat with his arms crossed and looked at Garrett with a slight challenge. "Well," he said, "are you going to talk about your theories again?" Emma tensed, her gaze darting to April. Garrett felt the air in the room thicken, but did not retreat. He sat down, looking at his family, the people he lived for, and the people who had become strangers. "Not theories," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Is it true? And I want you to hear it." April froze, her fork stopping halfway to her plate. Logan frowned but remained silent. Emma looked down, clutching her napkin. "Garrett," April began, her tone a warning. "Don't start. Not in front of children." "In front of the children," he said, looking into her eyes. "Because they deserve to know." "I'm filing for divorce, April." The words fell like a hammer. Emma gasped and her hand jerked, knocking over the glass of lemonade. Logan sat up straighter, his face flushed. "Are you serious?" he said, his voice full of anger. "You just take it and destroy everything." April jumped up, her eyes sparkling. "This is madness," she shouted. "You can't just take it and—" "What did you tell them? That I'm a bad mother? That everything is my fault?" Garrett didn't move. He expected this. Her screams, her attempts to turn everything over. He took out his phone, opened the entry from the cafe, and put it on the table. The volume was low, but Huntley's words, old times, free at last, were clear. "I didn't say that," he said. "It's you. And he, Brad Huntley, the one you were with before me. And it looks like he's still with him." Emma looked at the phone, her face pale. Logan clenched his fists, but his eyes were locked on April. She opened her mouth, but the words stuck. Her face was distorted not with anger, but with panic. It's not what you think," she said, her voice shaking. "This is an old recording, Garrett. You faked it to discredit me." Garrett shook his head, his voice remaining level. "Emma saw you," he said, "in the car, with him, a week ago. Are you saying she's lying too?" April turned to Emma, her eyes widening. "Emma, that's not true," she said, her voice becoming pleading. "Tell him you didn't see anything." Emma looked up, and there were tears in them. She shook her head. "I saw it, Mom," she whispered. "You were with him." Logan stood up, his chair clattering back. "This is nonsense," he said, but his voice was not as confident as before. "Both of you just want to destroy everything." He ran out of the room, slamming the door. April looked at Garrett, her face a mixture of rage and fear. "Are you satisfied?" she said, her voice breaking. "You turned them against me, You're a monster." Garrett stood up, his eyes cold. "I didn't set it up," he said. "You did it yourself. I'm filing for divorce, April. And I want kids to know why." April gasped, her hands shaking. She wanted to say something, but instead she turned around and ran out of the kitchen. Garrett heard the front door slam. She left. Again. Emma sat at the table, looking at the spilled lemonade. Her shoulders were shaking. Garrett walked over and squatted down next to him. "Hey," he said quietly. "Everything will be fine. I promise." She looked at him. Her eyes were full of pain, but there was something else in them. Trust. She nodded, and Garrett felt something inside him come to life. Not hope, but strength. He didn't lose her, and he won't lose Logan. Not now. Garrett Sloan sat in the courtroom, his hands on his knees, but his fingers trembled slightly. Not from fear, from tension. The room was small, with wood paneling and the smell of old paper. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s, leafed through documents, her pen tapping on the table. April sat across the aisle, her lawyer whispering something in her ear. She looked put together, a dark suit, her hair styled, her face flawless. But Garrett knew her too well. Her shoulders were tense, her lips pursed. She was losing control, and it showed. 3 months have passed since that dinner when he announced the divorce. 3 months full of screams, silence, and maneuvers. April didn't go away quietly. She fought like a hunted animal, and her weapons were sharp. Accusations, tears, attempts to win children over to her side. But Garrett was ready. Thanks to Jack, his lawyer, he held the cards. Today, everything was supposed to be decided. The trial began with formalities. Jack presented the case. Garrett was asking for a divorce on the grounds of adultery and wanted partial custody of Emma, as well as rights to the house he had built with his own hands. April's lawyer, a polished fellow named Marcus Lane, stood up, straightened his tie, and began his attack. "Your Honor," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "My client, April Sloan, was the victim of systematic pressure from her husband. Garrett Sloan is a man with an unstable character, prone to paranoia. He spied on her, violated her personal space, even installed cameras in their home. This is not the behavior of a loving husband. This is the behavior of a tyrant." Garrett felt the blood rush to his face. He knew April would try to do this, make him look like a monster. But he didn't move. Jack put his hand on his shoulder, whispering, "Calm down. We're ready." April took the floor, her voice trembling but full of conviction. She talked about how Garrett allegedly controlled her life, how he isolated her from her friends, and how his paranoia destroyed her family. She even cried, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief, and Garrett noticed how the judge frowned at him. It was her best move, playing the victim, and she played masterfully. But Jack was ready. When it was his turn, he stood up, holding a folder with a dossier in his hands. "Your Honor," he began, his voice calm but firm, "my client is not a tyrant. He is a man who tried to protect his family from lies. We have evidence that shows Mrs. Sloan led a double life, having an affair with Brad Huntley, a local politician, for many years." He submitted printouts of Huntley's letters to the judge. The letters were old, but their tone personal, intimate, spoke for itself. The judge leafed through them, her eyebrows slowly rising. "It's the past," Lane intervened, standing up. "These letters do not prove anything about the present." Jack nodded as if in agreement and pulled out the next folder. "Then let's talk about the present," he said. "We have an audio recording of Mrs. Sloan's conversation with Mr. Huntley, taken at the Blue River Cafe 4 months ago." April turned pale. Her lawyer stood up to protest, but the judge raised her hand in silence. She turned on the audio and Huntley's voice filled the room. "You're free now, April." Finally. Garrett looked at April and her mask began to crack. She clenched her hands into fists, her eyes darting between the judge and Jack. "It's a fake copy," she shouted, her voice breaking. "He set it up. He wants to take my children away from me." The judge looked at her, and her gaze was cold. "Mrs. Sloan, hold back," she said. "Mr. Hayes, continue." Jack filed more documents. Telephone logs showing regular calls from April to a number associated with David Crow, Huntley's assistant. Tracker statements confirming her trips to areas where she was not supposed to be. Financial reports showing unexplained expenses. Each piece of evidence was like a nail in the coffin of her lies. "My client didn't spy for control," Jack said, looking at the judge. He was collecting evidence to protect his family. He built their house, raised their children, and was an honest husband. Mrs. Sloane, on the other hand, manipulated the children against their father and led a secret life that undermined their marriage. April stood up, her face red with rage. "This is a lie," she shouted. "He's lying. They're all lying. I didn't cheat. Her lawyer grabbed her arm, forcing her to sit down, but it was too late. The judge looked at her with obvious disapproval. Garrett felt the tension in the room rising, but he remained calm. He knew Jack had done his job. Now everything depended on the judge. The meeting lasted 3 hours. April tried to defend herself, but her arguments crumbled under the weight of the evidence. She accused Garrett of cruelty, but could not provide a single witness. She spoke of her love for her children, but Emma, who gave a written statement, clearly wrote that she saw her mother with another man. Logan refused to testify, but his silence spoke louder than words. When the judge called a break, Garrett went outside to take a breath of cold air. Jack followed him, patting him on the shoulder. "She drowned herself," he said. "Her breakdown was a gift." The judge doesn't like hysterics. Garrett nodded but didn't answer. He looked at the gray sky, feeling tired. This was not a victory. It was survival. The decision was announced an hour later. The judge spoke clearly, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. Based on the evidence presented, the marriage between Garrett Sloane and April Sloane is dissolved. Mr. Sloane receives title to the house because he is its principal owner and builder. Custody of Emma Sloane is shared equally, with the preference to reside with Mr. Sloane based on his stability and the child's testimony. Mrs. Sloane is obligated to pay child support for Emma. April sat with her head down. Her lawyer tried to whisper something, but she didn't listen. Garrett looked at her, and for the first time in months he felt not anger, but emptiness. She lost. But he didn't win. Nobody won. After the trial, Garrett went home. The house was quiet and empty. Emma was with a friend. Logan didn't call. He walked into the living room, sat on the sofa, and looked at the photographs on the wall. Their wedding, Emma's first steps, Logan's graduation. He didn't take them off. Not because I wanted to remember, because it was part of his life, and he had no intention of erasing it. He took the dossier out of the garage and placed it on the table. It was thick, heavy with truth. He didn't know what to do with it. Maybe burn it. Maybe save it. But for now, he just looked at him, feeling something inside him starting to let go. April called in the evening. Her voice was weak, almost broken. "Garrett," she said, "we need to talk. About children. About everything." He paused, looking at the photograph of Emma on the wall. "Not now," he said. "Maybe later." He hung up and closed his eyes. Garrett Sloane stood on the porch of his house, looking out at the morning fog creeping across the lawn. The air was cold. There was a smell of wet grass and distant smoke. Someone was burning leaves in the neighboring yard. He held a mug of coffee in his hands. The steam rose to his face, warming his skin. 6 months have passed since the trial, and the world he knew has changed. He didn't collapse as he feared, but he became different. Quiet, empty, but not hopeless. He learned to live with it. He returned to work in construction, where everything was simple. Blueprints, concrete, steel beams. Work saved him, as always. Dan, his partner, didn't ask any more questions, but sometimes he would bring beer after his shift, and they would sit in the trailer, silently watching the sunset. It was not sympathy, but something better understanding. That was enough for Garrett. Emma now lived with him most of the time, but she herself has changed. It became quieter, but closer. They started talking not about the past, but about little things. About her school, about the new song she's learning, about how she wants to go to college in a couple of years. Sometimes she would ask about her mother, and Garrett would answer honestly, but without details. "She does what she can," he said, and Emma nodded without insisting. One evening, she went down to the kitchen where Garrett was preparing dinner, simple burgers, nothing special. She sat down at the table, looking at him. "Dad," she said, her voice soft but serious, "are you okay?" "Well, really." Garrett paused. holding the spatula over the frying pan. He was not used to such questions. I'm not used to being the one people worry about. Yeah, he answered, smiling. I'm fine, Em. And you? She shrugged, but her eyes were warm. Same. Logan was more difficult. He called less often and came even less often. His anger at Garrett turned to silence, but Garrett felt that this was not the end. He wrote messages to his son short, without pressure. How are you? Do you have time to stop by? Football on Saturday if you want. Logan didn't always answer, but when he did, it was like a ray of light. 2 months ago, he came over for the weekend, and they spent the day in the garage, tearing apart an old motorcycle Garrett had bought on the cheap. They hardly spoke, but they worked together, and it was better than any words. You're not giving up, are you? Logan said, wiping the oil off his hands. His voice was not angry, but tired. Nope, Garrett replied, handing him a wrench. You know me. Logan chuckled, but there was something in his eyes that Garrett hadn't seen in a long time. Not trust, not yet, but there's a hint of it. April called once a month, usually in the evening when Garrett was alone. Her voice was soft, almost broken, but it didn't budge. She talked about children, about how she wanted to fix everything. Sometimes she mentioned Huntley casually, as if he were just a colleague. Garrett didn't ask. He knew that Huntley had left the mayor's office after a scandal related to some contracts. Bart, the guy from the diner, said that April's name had come up in rumors, but without evidence. Garrett didn't care. He didn't want revenge. He wanted peace. Garrett, she said one last time, her voice shaking. I didn't want it to end like this. Is it true? He paused, looking at the dark window. I know, he said finally, but alas. He hung up and didn't take her calls anymore. Not out of hatred, simply because this was no longer his life. He began making small changes to the house. Repainted the kitchen light gray. Emma chose the color. I fixed the swing in the yard, although no one was swinging anymore. I bought a new TV so I can watch football with Logan if he comes over. These were not attempts to forget the past, but steps forward. Small but solid. Sometimes he took the file out of the garage, looked at it, but did not open it. It was like a scar, a reminder of the pain, but no longer bleeding. He didn't burn it, but he didn't need it either. The truth did its job. One evening, Emma walked into the living room where Garrett was watching an old Western. She sat down next to him, crossing her legs and resting her head on his shoulder. It was so unexpected that he froze. Dad, she said quietly, I'm glad you're here. He looked at her dark hair, the same as April's, but with his stubborn gaze. He smiled, feeling for the first time in a long time a warmth that didn't burn. Me too, Em, he said. Me too. Logan texted later that night. Maybe I'll stop by next week. Soccer, Garrett replied, waiting. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.